And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 44 of the Wake Up Podcast. And I have Alex Epstein, who is a philosopher, energy expert, author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, founder of the Center for Industrial Progress. And I'm sure the list goes on.
I like how you're laughing about it. People don't know I was just sort of making fun of titles in general. Before this, I always feel like I do speeches, and I feel like the longer the intro, just the more bored people are. And once you get started, people are going to know whether you know what you're doing or not. So you might as well just get into it.
I know the titles are always embarrassing for me whenever I get up on stage to give a talk or something. And, you know, especially the people who haven't really done the research, for example. So they've just cut and paste something off LinkedIn and they get this fucking rambling opening and figure out. I'm like,
and mispronounce the word. The one exception I found was when I first started the Center for Industrial Progress in 2011. This had just been an idea I came up with in a meeting once. And then a month or two later, it's like a real thing. And then the first time I got introduced as, this is president of the Center for Industrial Progress, like, wow, I made that. Like, whoa. I turned those words into a thing that others are using. And that one was barely an institution. But, now it's been an institution forever. So it just becomes like, okay, let's talk about real stuff.
Yeah, interesting. That actually kind of brings me to the first question I wanted to ask, which is, your background as kind of an Ayn Randian objectivist, sort of in that space. But before we actually get there, can you tell us about the Center for Industrial Progress? Like, can you, because that's 10 years now. So I don't know much about it, but can you tell us, what the premise was originally, what it's evolved into?
Definitely. So the premise was that there needed to be a positive alternative to the green movement, which I think is more accurately called the AntiHuman Impact movement.
Yeah, the eco-terrorist. Yeah.
Well, that's a subset of the AntiHuman Impact movement. Yeah, because the idea of green, if we're talking about Ayn Rand, it's what she would call a package deal. So what it's trying to do is put over something bad by associating it with something good. And so in this case, it's trying to put over the very bad thing of eliminating human impact on the earth by packaging it together with certain kinds of impact that we want to minimize or eliminate. Like, we want to minimize pollution when we can. We want to minimize the destruction of natural beauty. But if you call that being green or minimizing our impact, you're blending that together with opposing farms and factories and buildings. And this is just rampant in our society. We as a society are really pursuing avidly, usually unknowingly, this goal of eliminating impact. If you look at every area, the obsession is just how can we not impact the earth? And my view is this is totally wrong, but it's not enough just to attack it directly. There needs to be a positive alternative. And back in 2011, I would have put the alternative more as industrial progress because it's capturing the idea of intelligent, productive impact on the earth, and that's a good thing. Now I would frame it more broadly in terms of human flourishing. So we want to advance human flourishing, which means we want to increase people's ability to live to their fullest potential, like long, safe, healthy, happy, opportunity-filled lives. And then an aspect of that is that we embrace massive, intelligent impact on Earth. And of course, we want to avoid anti-human impacts wherever we can. But the premise was I was in a meeting at my, where I used to work at the Ayn Rand Institute. And I would just remember we were discussing things and I just had this idea, there needs to be a Center for Industrial Progress. And I was like, and I need to run it. There needs to be this. I thought I had to do this. And it was definitely, I still have a very good relationship with the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm actually speaking at their conference this summer. But it was that kind of idea where I felt I need to own this. It can't be, I'm asking anyone for permission or somebody else is overseeing it. It's I have this vision and I want to pursue it.
Brilliant. When I look at the world and, I think about, what we're really suffering from or what we're really lacking is, the hero archetypes in Ayn Rand stories, people who are willing to go out and take on a mission or a vision like this, that is grounded in some sort of first principles and not just, political fucking buffoonery that, sounds nice on the surface, but doesn't have any substance. So I guess on the topic of Ayn
I'm
Rand,
curious, do you think,
actually, go on.
I just, yeah, this is an interesting topic, because I think what you see no shortage of is like the pursuit of lofty declared visions of various kinds. And I think you see this even more so. There's, if you've ever seen that show Silicon Valley, even if you haven't, there's this cliche that begins on the first episode, which is just like every single founder of the company, whatever they're doing is like, and our goal is to make the world a better place. And it's this sort of like everyone is saying like, oh, I have this lofty vision, but where I think a lot of it breaks down, and where I think anyone trying to do something big has to really introspect, is ask like, how much of this is because I really believe that something is valuable, like I believe it's valuable for the world, in the world, versus I want the status of being somebody who's seen as changing the world. And I think very unfortunately, a lot of bad stuff happens because people want the status of being a world changer, and that often includes they want to be a world changer, ironically, in exactly the way the world is telling them to. So it's like, oh, I want to change the world by pursuing the goal of carbon neutrality only through solar panels and wind turbines and batteries. It's like, well, are you really changing? But it's such a status type of thing. And I think we always need to watch out for that, particularly more ambitious people.
Very true. There's, I mean, yeah, there's one famous guy that, I don't even want to mention his name because he's a moron, that I don't want to, that I think fits that bill. But to that point, I think it's a blend of two things. So you've got, exactly what you just mentioned there, is that, they think they're contrarians, they think they're doing something, like against the grain, or that is, kind of like, the original fuck you, I won't do what you tell me from Rage Against the Machine, and today it's sort of become like, fuck you, I'll do exactly what you tell me. And kind of like it's almost the, the counterculture has become the primary culture. And it's no longer, they've become the mainstream, and they think they're doing something, important. So it becomes a status symbol based on, where the herd is going and what's politically correct and everything. But I also think, there's a lack of time spent on understanding first principles and ensuring that which you're pursuing has some sort of consistent thread from, like either a priori truths or some sort of foundation that is stable. Like, it's very nice to say up here, and I did a podcast a while ago saying that, I believe equality is the biggest scam, ever perpetrated, on, in humanity, because, nothing in nature or the universe or humanity, there's nothing fucking equal about us. There's a very big difference between fairness and equality, and the only way you can get equality is if you bring everybody down to the same level, because you can't force people up, right? So inequality, and particularly dynamic inequality, is how the world thrives. Like, you see it in all complex systems. But it sounds really nice to say, oh, we should pursue equality. So what people are doing is they're sort of pursuing this, this easy surface level, nice little shiny thing, without actually taking the time to inquire about, what does that actually mean? Does it have any substance? Is it, grounded in some sort of first principle? Like, does it have a foundation upon which we can build? And nobody wants to ask those questions anymore, because, things like struggle and pain and effort and everything are vilified as things that we should avoid. Like, what's the easiest path?
Do you think that's sorry, well, we can talk about that in a minute. I just want to talk about what you just mentioned, because there's a lot of, I think, important stuff there in terms of, so I'd think of this as, definitely you want to be, in the broadest sense, reflective on what goals you're choosing, and particular, and what types of actions you're taking to achieve those goals, particularly if you have any kind of historical perspective. One thing that rightly scares the hell out of me, and doesn't scare many people nearly enough, is the fact that most majorities, even majorities of smart people in history, are what we would regard as totally wrong. So I think that should scare people. Like, you look at the past and you just think, oh yeah, well, like racism was viewed as totally moral and scientific, or at least substantially so, by, many smart people. I mean, the 20th century just had just unbelievable amounts of mass murder, including in Germany, which was regarded as the most sophisticated place in the world intellectually. So just the comfort that people take in quote unquote consensus positions, and they're always even consensus as revealed by their direct channels, not even like they even discover the consensus, which we talk about with climate or other things, where often what we're told is the consensus is not even a consensus. And even if it was a consensus, doesn't mean it's right. And what this implies at minimum is you want to be very reflective and inquisitive about what you're pursuing in life and how. And this goes back to, is the motive really an independent view that this is creating value in reality, or is it status? Because when it's status, then the default thing is just take whatever goals and whatever types of actions the society says are good, and just do them. And so in the realm of talk about equality, but in the realm of energy and climate, it's just remarkable how everyone takes the goal as, yeah, let's eliminate fossil fuels or eliminate our CO2 emissions. Like that's the number one thing we should be focused on as a society. Nobody thinks, wait, is that really the number one thing? Like, is it even a thing, but is that really the number one thing? Like billions of people are desperately poor, like optimizing for eliminating CO2. Is that really going to be? So there's no thought about that, the goal. But even then the actions to achieve the goal, it's you achieve it via renewable, which means solar and wind specifically. So you don't use nuclear, you oppose hydroelectric. And so both of these, I mean, to put it charitably, are very questionable. I mean, the idea that your overall goal is let's eliminate CO2 emissions and that you're going to restrict yourself to solar panels and wind turbines in particular, which you can notice a bunch of obvious challenges to. But yet that is considered, if you look at some of the smartest people, smartest companies, I mean, you take like Jeff Bezos, who's, in my view, an incredibly smart person, one of the greatest productive geniuses in history, maybe from a purely like competent standpoint. My view, which is not fully a professional view, but maybe the most skilled CEO in the history of human beings, and has a father with a background in the oil and gas industry, and has said in interviews that solar can't possibly power the earth. Nevertheless, still has, took over a stadium, named it Amazon Climate Pledge Arena, and then has publicly said, we're going to pursue this via renewables with no mention of nuclear. So even somebody like that is doing it. And so it shows, and there's somebody with completely unlimited means, and who is a reflective guy in, many, many ways. I mean, he's sure more than I am in a lot of ways, but in terms of like his basic goals and then the basic types of actions he's going to take to achieve them, they're unbelievably conventional. And again, the conventional goals and actions are very dubious. So it's not a coincidence. It's not like, oh yeah, 95% of the people just believe these because they're so compelling. It's like, that's because what we're given them, and we're given very superficial, not very persuasive reasons, but the fact that everyone believes them and the fact that there's a lot of status to be gained from adhering to them, that proves decisive.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, okay. So in that sense, that's probably the overriding force in that case. And I think by and large, I guess what I'm hearing there is that irrespective of how deep someone chooses to think and how first principled and everything they are, the force, the overarching force of being politically correct or the status play or whatever, it seems to even push the intelligent of us into parroting these same points about renewable energy and everything, which I guess I would agree.
Lives there. I mean, you just think about how many people's, how many smart people are working on things that I can't prove this yet. We'd have to talk about the details of these, but I think a huge number of people are just wasting their time working on very unpromising technologies and particularly likely to be uneconomic technologies. And it's often the smartest people. Actually, a counter example that I found notable, there's a very, very smart guy named Jacob DeWitt who runs a company called Oklo, which is a nuclear company, that is doing some exciting stuff. And I remember I met him, and it was so striking that, oh my gosh, here's like a really smart guy. And he's the type of guy you would expect to go into one of these fields that's not promising. Today you would. Energy is somewhat unique because energy is not, I mean, energy is actually a cautionary tale, because you look at energy as incredibly guided by the problematic moral framework of the society, which really says that our goal should be to eliminate our impact on nature. That's like the driving thing in our society. And energy is totally being overtaken by that. Whereas if you look at other fields, like at least for a while, like whether you're creating social networks or phones, those have been very peripheral concerns. Now with the rise of what they call ESG, it's becoming a little bit more central. But you look at other fields, like fields my friends have gone into and succeeded in, and they're not facing the same kind of pressure to be green, and thus they do really innovative things because they're free to just pursue what's profitable, which means really what's productive. But in energy, it's not true. So I was just so impressed to see this really smart, innovative guy who clearly could have, started a cylinder or maybe even a more successful version of that. But he chose to go into nuclear. I always find that, as a social exercise, I always love those aberrations, like the person who could be successful on the status quo, yet chose to go a different direction, versus the person who's just kind of like a loser or an outcast, and it's just like, oh, they want an alternative thing because no one would want them. But we would rather be in a society where you didn't have those bad forces. And then just one other force is that, in the educational system or anti-educational system, which I think most of what we have today is, it very early, the degree to which you encourage and teach, and how to teach is a question, but teach independent thinking has a huge impact on these things, because it's really setting you up for how much are you going to think about the world, how much are you going to question things. And I think there are numerous forces where people are just told, like, you shouldn't question things. And which you could talk about in terms of conventional religions, but also secular religions, where people are like, oh, you can't, like, you're told when you're 7 that, oh, we're destroying the planet and you should write a letter to the president and something like that. And it's just like, oh, you've totally taken that on faith. And even your whole focus on, oh, the planet is something above us that we can, quote, destroy and we should sacrifice it. Like, that's a whole perspective. So there's just this so much what Ayn Rand would call second-handedness, so not, or intellectual dependence. And I think those two work together a lot, because if you grow up and you're not taught intellectual independence, and you're taught to just believe and follow all the conventional things, at least on the big issues, and then you're in a society where there's a lot of status rewards for doing something, why are you going to question that? It takes two, you can't expect that of most people. And I like to have societies where the dynamics are in place where not only the exceptional people do good things. I like the dynamics to be in place, if possible, where even kind of the average person is incentivized to do like more independent thinking, and including reflecting on all these basic issues.
Yeah, well, that would lead me into a Bitcoin discussion, but let's save that for later.
Okay.
So where do you so I guess we've got these threads, or these forces that that drive people into energy derangement syndrome and fiat derangement syndrome and all of this stuff. Where some people come out and say, oh, look, it's a conspiracy, it's the Bilderbergs and the lizard people that are doing this. Then someone else will come out and say, yep, it's just a bunch of morons who like confusing themselves and pushing agendas or whatever. Like, what do you think is, like, why do you think the sort of anti-human sentiment and the clearly, you said questionable, but I would say moronic, push for renewables and things like that, like, where does that sort of stem from, and what do you think helps that message, like, whether in education or in media or in politics and all this sort of, like, why is that being spread? Like, do these idiots not understand that they're gonna drive the world towards complete energy collapse and we're all going to die of fucking starvation. It's like, it's not an intelligent path to head down. So what do you think causes the derangement?
Well, I think a lot of what's going on is that, so I wouldn't call a lot of these things idiotic. I think a lot of what's going on is that there are very bad ideas that are kind of led by a relatively small group of people who know that they are anti-human ideas and embrace that, but they have been put forward in the world as pro-human ideas. So I think the basic, if you and so I put all of this under what I call the anti-impact framework or anti-human impact framework. So I think there's basically a certain framework that serves as a starting structure for our thinking that most of us are using, but we don't really know that we're using it. And part of the framework is to conceal what we're doing. So that's a very abstract intro to it. But if you just take, like, I think the core, the core elements of the anti-impact framework are, number one, the idea that our goal should be to eliminate human impact on the rest of nature. And as I said before, this goal is everywhere. Every field, we are focused above all on eliminating human impact. You look at an energy, what's our number one goal? It's like eliminating our impact on climate. Like, that's the number one thing. But it's not just there. You look at, why are we hostile to nuclear energy? Why are we hostile to hydro? There's hostility to solar and wind. People claim that, solar and wind are the salvation, which I think is completely indefensible. But even there, that whole anti-fossil fuel movement doesn't seem too concerned that it's really hard to build these solar panels and wind turbines and infrastructure. Like, there's no plans at all for the materials. There's no plans for building the infrastructure, the transmission lines at the way. So we have this, in energy is just an example, we have this whole field where the whole driving force is, let's stop impact, let's stop impact, let's stop impact. And that is just considered totally okay. Like, that's considered totally okay.
But
even
what's
though
the incentive for that, though? I don't get what the incentive to that is. Sorry for cutting you off there, but it's like, what?
Well, I think so. What's the incentive if you get? Because I don't think most people, like, I think if I say that, many people say, "Oh, wow, that is kind of true," but I didn't really think about it, because each one, if you notice, like, each one has its own kind of pro-human justification. So with fossil fuels, it's like, oh, well, the CO2, that's gonna, heat up the planet and make it unlivable. You're like, okay, great, that's why you oppose fossil fuels. But then it's like, oh, but nuclear, you would love that, right? Oh, no, that's radiation. And you're like, okay, but levels of radiation are not a problem at all. It's actually safer. And they're like, oh no, the waste. And it's like, okay, the waste, why? Because it lasts a long time. Yeah, but it's pretty benign. We know how to deal. And it's like, they'll bring up another type of impact, and it kind of seems pro-human, but it's like, okay, you have a reason there. And then hydro, it's like another one, like, oh, maybe the dam could burst. Okay, that's kind of pro-human, but if it could save the world from CO2, which you said is so bad, wouldn't it be worth it? And then you can see, like, these threads of, oh no, but they really seem concerned with the free flowing rivers more than the people who need electricity. And with the solar and wind, it's like, oh yeah, this takes up the landscape and it's killing these birds and stuff. So I don't think it's, but each one has its own kind of plausibility. It's like, oh, it's ruining our beautiful view. But if you look at it overall, it's like, oh no, we're opposing every form of energy, and the dominant thread is this impact. But so part of what's going on, which goes on with a lot of the stuff, is there's always this pro-human disguise that anti-human policies have. And I think that's just a universal thing throughout history, that anti-human ideas are always disguised in pro-human ways. And there are many, many clever forms of doing it. And one I mentioned already, which is the idea of packaging together something anti-human with something pro-human. So if you say, like, green, or you'll say protect the environment or save the planet, we think it means, that means, yeah, we can talk about that one too. That one, we think it means, oh yeah, like, we're going to have a really good planet for us. And in reality, no, it's like, we're going to have an untouched planet saved from us. But like, so the goal is being distorted in that way. And so you ask, like, so I think for most people, a substantial part of it, not all of it, but is this pro-human disguise, particularly if the pro-human disguise, if the positive of that is not being owned by somebody else. And this is a key reason why I've done the work that I've done in terms of having a positive alternative. Is a key part of my work is, yeah, we do want a beautiful world. We do want a safe environment. We do want a clean environment. And we achieve that through energy and through development and through mastery of nature. So it's allowing people to have, so the genius of the green movement was that they owned this issue of environmental quality and safety, and the pro-capitalism side never owned that. So people felt like, oh yeah, this is an important concern, and these guys are making a big deal of it, and I agree it's an important concern, and there's no alternative, so I guess I'm going to embrace these guys. And yeah, they seem to be a little too opposed to factories, and they seem to oppose too much, and they seem to be extreme, but hey, I want to protect the environment too, right? So that's another thing where they have these pro-human concerns, and then they monopolize them, and then they package them with these bad things. I think that's most people, a lot of what's going on. I think the other thing that's going on that applies to everyone is what I call this delicate nurture view of nature, which is the idea that nature is stable, sufficient, and safe. So it doesn't change too much. It gives us what we need, and it's going to keep us safe as long as we don't impact it. And you see this view everywhere, like from the Lion King to ecology textbooks. And it's a totally false view. Nature is not like that at all. It's actually dynamic, deficient, and dangerous. I call it wild potential, not a delicate nurture. But we have this belief. And because we have this belief, what it does is it makes us, when we see these policies to eliminate human impact, one thing is we're not too worried about it because we don't realize how much of how good our lives is impacting the earth. We're just like, oh yeah, if we don't do anything, it's all going to be natural. Like we'll get Evian and Fiji, and they portray themselves as natural versus no clean water for you if you're living in a natural place, or even very little available food. The other thing is so delicate nurture, you don't see the benefits of energy and more broadly of impacting the world because you kind of have this baseline view that, oh, everything will be good if we don't do much. And then the other thing, and even more powerful thing, is you're incredibly susceptible to catastrophe claims. Because if you think the world is this delicate nurture that exists in this delicate balance, then the number one threat to your well-being is us impacting nature. And so what happens is people, whenever they hear that something impacts nature, particularly some side effect like CO2 or radiation, or some air pollution, there's this tendency to what I call catastrophize it, and that involves two elements. So one is to wildly overstate or overestimate the actual nature of the impact. So with CO2, it would be like thinking it's 10 times more powerful than it is. Like people just have no actual sense. I do believe it impacts climate, but they just think it's like this overwhelming force that's really, the earth is hotter than ever. So they overstate the actual impact. But the other thing they do is they don't see our ability to master the impact if it's negative. And I point this out with climate, that climate-related disaster deaths, so from floods and storms and wildfires, et cetera, they're down 98% over the last century as CO2 emissions have risen dramatically. Now, why is that? Well, one thing is the CO2 emissions have had nowhere near the scale of impact that people think, certainly negative impact that people think. But the main thing is that we've used our minds, and in particular energy from fossil fuels, machines powered by fossil fuels, to make the naturally dangerous climate very safe. So we've mastered climate. But just ask, how many people know that climate deaths are down? And how many people even think of climate mastery when they think of fossil fuels? Like, look at almost, with a few exceptions, even any fossil fuel company, when they talk about climate, they will never talk about how they actually protect us from climate. Never. They only talk about negatives. And so part of that, a lot of that is this delicate nurture premise that everyone just believes, oh yeah, we live in this perfect delicate balance. The planet is perfect until we screw it up. And so, yeah, if we're impacting things, that's going to lead to catastrophe. So if these people are eliminating our impacts, they must be helping us. So if you combine this idea of you're packaging the idea of eliminating impact with a good environment and you're owning that issue, and then you're putting forward this idea that impact is going to destroy the delicate nurture that nurtures you, like that makes it so that's a lot of how this framework works. And the other thing, which I can talk about if you want, is sort of why the leaders believe this, because the leaders know that most of this stuff isn't true. Like they know that eliminating impact means eliminating humans. Just like if you eliminated bear impact, that means you're eliminating bears. Like eliminating human impact means eliminating humans. But the leaders know this. Most people don't know this, but the leaders know this, and yet they support it. And that's an interesting set of motives.
That's where I wanted to go, because like everything you've described is basically what makes this, a popular, model of the world, right? And that's what gets the general populace on board with it.
Yes.
But yeah, like what I'm interested in is the whoever is packaging this together, what their thoughts are. But before you answer that, I just wanted to make one point about the delicate nurture thing. Is I've always before I discovered your work or any of that sort of stuff, I've always kind of envisioned a spectrum between like completely wild nature, like the jungle, on one side of the spectrum. Then you've sort of got the dry concrete jungle of like of an ugly fucking city. But then you've sort of got the garden in the middle, and like sort of mastery for me is like the garden is like you need to weed the garden, you need to like keep it clean, you need to trim the shrubs and all this sort of stuff to keep it beautiful. But it's kind of like a blend of both. Like if we go too far on one side, I've been in some really ugly cities, like San Jose in Costa Rica is the ugliest fucking city I've ever been to, or Sao Paulo in Brazil. But it's just like all decrepit, ugly ass buildings that have been, like the state has basically destroyed, nature in the process. And that's sort of one side of the spectrum. But then on the other side, like I've been to places like that of the jungle, and it's kind of got its novelty in the beginning, but man, once you like fall over and fuck yourself up and everything, like, bugs and mosquitoes and shit, like, you're like, fucking hell, like it really is important for humans to actually, to form, some sort of, livable structure around them. And that's why I kind of always envision, the garden as, and you could argue like, this almost has a, a religious element to it, like, the Garden of Eden, like the whole process of, I love the word mastering nature. I was going to say taming, but taming is probably not the right word. I think mastering is the right framework for this. Is like when we can do that, like we can actually live in in a beautiful place. So I think that's
well, so it's interesting really that it's a continuum, because I think this often happens, because I think it's a false alternative, which is another thing Ayn Rand was really good at pointing out. So I think that so there's this idea of like, okay, there's this, now you're describing it more accurately, but there's this idea of minimally impacted. Now, the green movement would view that as the Garden of Eden. So they actually take that idea and they apply it to unimpacted nature. But then there's this caricature of, it's not to say it's a caricature doesn't mean that it never exists, but it means that it's a caricature of the general phenomenon of human attempts to impact. Like, yeah, it's the ugliest, like stalest thing, and you're never outdoors and that kind of thing. And then the green movement would add on to that, like totally false stuff, like, oh yeah, you're not going to live very long and stuff. Whereas even in those cities, like you're living way longer than you would in the jungle, and yet it still leaves a lot to be desired. And I think the key is, like, if you view it from a human flourishing perspective, what you're really thinking of is your positive is like a healthy human environment. But that doesn't mean a healthy human environment includes a lot of different non-human living and non-living things. And, I practice what I preach. Like relative to my income, I probably spend a lot of money and a lot of time to live like, much more outdoors than almost anybody I know, like even trying to work outdoors and like going to the beach, going to the beach every day, and just really, loving the ocean. And just because I really feel that in terms of how much that affects me. And so I'm all for that, but it is, and so mastering is a good kind of perspective, because what you want to get, I think of nature as wild potential. So wild potential doesn't mean bad. It means wild, and wild isn't good or bad. It's just like, it's out of your control. And what you want to do is you want to harness the best elements and make them serve you. So, and unfortunately, I think when one consequence when you've got these false alternatives is that people who are generally doing the right thing, like they're trying to be productive and create progress, they often don't think very carefully about about really what are about creating a wonderful human environment. And so one of my favorite people in this regard is Frank Lloyd Wright, who is an architect, and I think a brilliant architect. And he had this combination of really loving just all the amazing things in the world that we live in, like the naturally occurring things, but then wanting to create better things, but in a way that isn't just like ugly and totally inconsistent. So like, his famously falling water, which, very much integrates with the landscape, whereas you see so much other architecture and other stuff. And it's just, I was in Florida the other day, and a certain part of it is like a random, terrible, like, this is ugly. How could you live in this? And the caricature of someone like me is like, oh, you don't care. Like, as long as we're painting things and building, it's like, no, you need to apply a lot of judiciousness to actually creating a great human environment. But that means that you double down on human flourishing, not that you try to eliminate your impact.
Yeah, aesthetics, have sort of, been forgotten in many ways. Okay, so let's loop back to the leaders. So I really want to dig into this because this for me is interesting. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I love Ayn Rand's depiction of the idiot professor and James Taggart and all that sort of stuff, who are basically, flawed humans attempting to justify their existence, and in the process, kind of destroying the shit around them. But I'd be curious on sort of what's your take with, I guess leaders and politicians of today, the Al Gore types and everything, and the Bill Gates maniacs, like, who, genuinely seem to be pushing some sort of agenda, which is blatantly insane to anyone who's taken a moment to think about it. So, talk me through that.
I mean, I tend to think these things are less obvious than you're portraying them as, or though we may agree with
maybe.
I wouldn't put, I would put Al Gore and Bill Gates in very different moral categories. Not to say I don't have issues with Gates, but like Gore is, I think, a very consistent kind of villain. Although even there, he made a really good speech at Steve Jobs' funeral. So even like, a lot of these characters are mixed. But I think the first observation I want to have, so there's this question, I mean, the way it's often put to me is with the kind of stuff I deal with, which is really anti-human thinking, because anti-human impact is really just anti-human, is like, why are humans anti-human? Like, why are smart human, and it's not just, oh, they're deluded. It's not just, oh, they didn't know energy was important and then all the power got cut off, or like the Texan who didn't realize, oh yeah, wind and solar, it doesn't work very well during a snowstorm. It's not that kind of thing. It's like, no, they know full well wind and solar don't work, and they know full well wind and solar are being opposed for their impacts, and they don't care. They just like, and so why does that kind of thing happen? I think the first observation is not unique to the anti-human impact movement. Like, throughout history, there have been very smart people who knew in very demonstrable ways that there was going to be a lot of human suffering and death from their policies, and yet pursued them nonetheless. I think communism in the 20th century would be top on the list of that, in terms of particularly, once you move, I mean, you could say maybe in 1910, people are confused, but are they confused in 1950, in 1960? When you just had mass murder of tens of millions of people and mass starvation and stuff, and pushing this kind of thing and just attacking capitalism uncritically. And I think, so it's just a very common phenomenon for smart humans to embrace anti-human ideas, even when they have the evidence that they're anti-human ideas. And I think Ayn Rand's work is unique in terms of illuminating this. And maybe Atlas Shrugged as a book is most unique. And then also she has some essays, including one called The Age of Envy in her book. I believe it's now called Return of the Primitive, that collection of essays, if people want to see that essay. And what she observes is that, well, I'll just give my own view. I won't attribute it to her, but I was definitely influenced by her, where, if you look at, maybe one way to look at this is just ask ourselves, like, hey, have there ever been times when we have felt any sliver of like an anti-human motive, like where we've wanted to do something that would hurt other human beings? I think most of us would say at one point or another, we've experienced some sort of envy for other people. Like, if somebody, we felt they were like superior to us or better looking or happier. And I'm not saying I'm driven by this. I don't think I'm driven by this very much at all now, and not even that much as a kid, but I've at least felt it where I know what it is. And I think many people are really driven by it. Like, there's such a thing as when you see people that you regard in some way as superior to you and you feel inferior, And like one response to that is to want to tear them down. And I think if you look at our society, there's a lot of hostility like to billionaires and to productive people. And it can't just be explained by the fact that some of them don't deserve it, because some of them clearly do. And I think there's that kind of envy motivation, or what Ayn Rand would call hatred of the good for being the good. And that really drives, I think that really motivates a lot of stuff. So in her book Fountainhead, there's this character Ellsworth Toohey, who very much has this kind of motive. In Atlas Shrugged, many of the characters, including James Taggart, have it. I just think that if you look at these anti-human, so if you look at the green movement, what does the green movement say? Well, it says that impact is bad and we should eliminate it. Well, what does that mean? That means that all the really productive people who are making a lot of money by, producing particularly like physical goods and services, like those people are bad. And who's good? Well, you're good if you do nothing, or if you tear down the things of the people who built things, right? So you can even see there's kind of a little nice psychological incentive, right? Like you can become superior to others by doing nothing. And those other people who are doing a lot, whom you somehow think of as superior to you, no, you're actually better than they are. So it's like somebody can be accomplishing nothing. And it's like, oh, then they can tell Charles Koch, oh no, you're villain. At least I'm not like you. Whereas in reality, Charles Koch, of the infamous Koch brothers, like he's in reality creating oil-based products that people want and paper towels that people want, etc. So it's really created this amazing moral incentive, particularly the green movement, where by doing nothing, like by being a total loser by normal human standards, you are a hero. And you're even more of a hero if you tear things down, and you're a villain if you actually produce things. And that should seem familiar, like with our current society. Like think about so many of the people who are admired have produced nothing, and they're either doing nothing or they're actively tearing things down. And of course, they claim to want, I really want the green energy, but they don't look into it. They don't know how it works, and they're not too concerned that it's being stopped. There's definitely a motive of tearing things down.
Okay, so we've got this underlying, envy. I think Ellsworth too is probably actually the poster child for that, because he kind of represents that envious character who didn't actually create or build anything for himself, but he just sort of emulates the critic that just wants to earn significance by tearing another down. Actually, Tony Robbins has a really good framework about this. So he talks about he kind of transformed Maslow's hierarchy of needs into what he calls the 6 human needs, and I think it's the most powerful framework for understanding human action that exists. And
wow.
There's this certainty, uncertainty, there's significance, connection, and then there's growth and contribution. You can basically understand all human action through the requirement for a human being to meet those needs. And the first 4 needs, so certainty, uncertainty, significance, and connection, are like the primal physical needs. We all have to meet those in order to live, and we meet them through different vehicles. And then growth and contribution are sort of like the higher level spiritual needs, which not many people meet, but some do as they kind of become more mature humans. But significance is one of these ones where there is empowering ways to meet the need of significance. It's like you create something, you build something, you add some value. You win a race, you write a song, whatever. So there's many empowering ways, but other ways to meet the need of significance as a human being is to make somebody less significant than you are, so to tear them down, and this is sort of where things like envy spawn. But envy is actually a vehicle through which to meet the need of significance in a very low level, immature way. And these days, like this is where I think the world is suffering from a lack of meaning. People aren't pursuing meaning anymore. They're pursuing fucking happiness, and happiness is like this surface level. To me, happiness is like one of the cheapest things to pursue because it's a side effect of pursuing meaning, for example. But people are pursuing these surface level things, so they want to get the cheapest, quickest, easiest way to meet their needs. And with significance in particular is just tear somebody else down, rip them down, like point out their flaws, be a critic, etc. And the Ellsworth Tooheys of the world, really represent that well. But so we've got, envy as one of the drivers, and would you say that's one of the drivers behind these leaders who are packaging the anti-human stuff, or do you think they're kindling that in the masses so that they can perpetuate this message?
I think
Or is it
both, but I was
Okay.
more focused on in the leaders, and
Mm-hmm.
it's there's really interesting interplay that I don't fully understand, like how much of it is because what we know, I mean, what we know for sure, I won't say everyone thinks this, but I think is just, I think it's clearly true that we have thought leaders who, and really the whole, what I would call knowledge systems, the whole, like, all our institutions that are trying to figure out what's true and communicate it to us, like, it's totally saturated by this anti-human idea of eliminating our impact on the
Mm-hmm.
earth. Like, I think that's undoubtedly true, and I think it's undoubtedly true that it's an anti-human idea. And so I think there are these psychological things, but whatever is going on, but it can also like reinforce things, because like the more that you, like, once you buy into that explicitly, then I imagine there are these different kinds of dynamics that I don't fully understand. So for me, the focus in my background is mainly philosophy. Like for me, it's to be confident that these things are going on and that they're wrong, and then how to deal with them. And in part, that affects how I address people. So when I'm addressing people, I'm not assuming any particular motive. It's more like I'm talking to them as if, like, I'm telling them, hey, like, I'm acting as if, or I'm assuming, hey, like, you really care about your life and other people's lives in some real honest way, and I'm gonna act on that. Versus, like, if I'm talking to somebody who believes in climate catastrophe, and I just say, oh yeah, well, it's just because you never really achieved very much, and so that's why you're doing, like, that's not very helpful, and it would be
Yeah.
arbitrary to apply to them, even though if I know on a macro level that is true. And I think it's particularly, the more you're talking about like the movement people where their identity is wound up in this, the more those motives are going on. And also it's much harder to persuade them. I think it's actually, I've been able to persuade a lot of people on this issue, but the people where it's their identity, it's very hard. So my archetypical example is Al Gore. Like, if Al Gore admitted that I was right about energy, like, he would have to say, oh my gosh, my life has been such a net negative in the world. Like,
100%.
everyone would be way
100%.
better off if I had never been here. Like, that's a hard thing to do. I think one should, just as a random thing, I believe that one should think about one's life in a way that you're willing to admit that. I when I was 18, I was making some big decisions about what I believed, or like coming to some big conclusions. And I was like, okay, the deal is, like, you always have to change your mind if somebody proves you wrong, even if you're 80 and you realize you've been advocating the wrong thing for
Mm-hmm.
whatever the next 62 years at that point. It's like, you have to do that. I think that should be an attitude that everyone has, but it's a hard attitude to have if you're.
It is. It requires a high degree of courage, man. Like, so. I mean, I was actually in the renewable energy industry when I was 24, 25, 26.
Oh,
Like,
I
I
didn't
thought
know
that
that.
was like, seriously, I was installing solar panels and all that stuff. And
How old
I
are
had
you? How old
bought,
are you now?
so 34. So
Okay, so
it's
not
been a
that long
while.
ago.
Yeah. So and I had drunk the Kool-Aid. Like, I genuinely thought what I was doing was, helping humanity and that shit. And I went through a whole phase of like really kind of, I mean, what one would categorize as kind of lefty social justice warrior type thinking. Like, I went fucking vegan. I did all sorts of crazy shit, right? And I've always been a really critical thinker, though. So the things that have always interested me have always been sort of math, physics, philosophy, and kind of where they interplay and meet.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into that thinking that I found something meaningful, but I guess luckily my personality made me question everything along the way. And like, I've actually been on that side, and I took the hero, like I call it, I climbed Mount Stupid, but I realized that it was really dumb up here, so I like ran back down really quickly. And a lot of people don't they either, like what you said, they climb Mount Stupid and they're up the top there and they're like, man, I've just put all this work into climbing up here, and I've like staked my identity on this. that they stay up there for the rest of their lives. They're not willing to actually admit that, hey, I was wrong. And or they're not even, or they remain just ignorant to it, to the point where that they refuse to acknowledge anything that points to the contrary. And I don't know. I feel like that's not to blow smoke up my own asshole, but I feel like that's a really rare trait in the world. Like I genuinely, like I set out to write a book about how veganism was the path to absolute health and strength and all that stuff. And by the time I got halfway through writing the book, I was like, okay, this is bullshit. So I threw it away.
That's
And
so funny. It is.
so,
I think it is. And yeah, I mean, we don't want to be too self-congratulatory here, but it is. I think it's the most important point is something you can encourage in a society. I mean, some element of it, I don't think you can control because it's ultimately up to people's choice, but at least you want it that this is considered a virtue, and that even, admitting that you're wrong, changing your mind, but doing it you have some people who change their mind in ways that just imply that convey that they're just very dogmatic in general. Like they'll just be totally gung-ho. Like if you're totally gung-ho and act like 100% certain about something, and then you're convinced that it's substantially wrong, you should not be totally certain about another thing in 3 months, which often
yes.
happens. It should make you, I mean, you could be certain about certain things, but it's like you want to, and another just sign is you want to, with people talking, you want to see like, do they acknowledge degrees of certainty or uncertainty with different kinds of things versus no, everything is like I'm 100% confident in everything I believe. And it would be like, oh yeah, okay, as a vegan yesterday, or as a vegan 3 months ago, and now I'm carnivore, and I know that that's the be all end all to everything, and nobody can tell me differently. Like that's not what you want, but you want is somebody who, so I think at least as you get older, it should be shifting less quickly, but there should be these shifts of, even at the very least, there should be the shifts of, it's, even if you're in the right direction, it's evolving. Like people would be shocked at how much I think about my own views on energy, like constantly, and I'm challenging them, but it's like, I'm willing to challenge all of them, but it's not like, oh, I'm challenging the fundamentals, but it's just like every little thing about how to explain them. Is this exactly right? And even like the issue we just talked about in terms of, okay, what exactly is psychologically driving the leaders versus the followers? Like I'll continue to think about that for the next 5 years and get clearer on that versus feeling like, oh no, I have to have the answer now. And the answer now must be right. And it can't be incomplete or it can't be wrong.
I think what you mentioned there is like the time it takes. Like for me, what I've tried to cultivate in my life, at least, particularly over the last 10 years, as I, because in my early 20s, I was very like, jumping onto things and like, kind of exploring, right? Discovering as a young guy. But, what I've definitely tried to cultivate more recently as I've matured, is finding threads of consistency. Like I did a podcast a little while ago with Zuby, the rapper dude, and the title of the podcast was Principles. And like there's millions of methodologies. Like we can do things many different ways, but there's certain principles which are Lindy compatible, like that they actually make sense over time. And these principles don't just disappear tomorrow. Like they're timeless in a sense, because they work, and over time they work more and more. So that's sort of the linear compatible nature of like particular principles. And what I try and do in life these days is like find principles that actually work, make sense, and that have stood the test of time, as opposed to just the next fashionable idea that that is popular in the mainstream. That's usually for me, like if I see something popular in the mainstream, that's like the first sign of like, okay, this is probably hasn't been thought through. And yeah, anyway, I just think that first principles thinking for me, like, and I found these threads across like, eating naturally, for example, like non-processed food and all the fucking junk that people, put into their bodies these days. Like Austrian economics, has like these threads of, consistency in it that, I also find, in Bitcoin, and, the energy discussion as well, like, the productive human and mastering nature as opposed to being at the whims of the wild, etc. So there's a lot of consistency across a lot of this thinking, and it's just, I don't know, it's interesting for me to find other human beings that have converged on these through their own paths, and we sort of come to this, this almost contrarian consensus, I guess, in the world today.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the principles thing. So this is another thing where I'd definitely recommend, if people are interested in principles, check out Ayn Rand. Particularly, she has a book called Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, and then her heir, philosopher Leonard Peikoff, has a book called Objectivism: The Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Particularly, chapter 4 deals with the issue of context, and I think that one important distinction. So she's very into false alternatives, and so in terms of how we deal with abstractions, including principles, there's this false alternative throughout the history of philosophy called rationalism versus empiricism. And so the empiricists, or the rationalists rather, the people who would characterize themselves as like, oh, we believe in principles, but the principles would tend to be detached from reality in numerous ways. And it would often be like, they're just sort of in their own head and they make up these ideas, and that the ideas fit together, but then the ideas go up, they go against reality. And, the empiricists would be like, oh, we're totally connected to reality. We're only using observation, often what they'll call is we're only using experience, but then they'll never draw anything abstract. So it's just like, oh, I'm looking out, and it's like they look up and it's like, oh, here blue now. Like that's all I know, right? They'll say like, you can't know anything. And so, her idea is that, you want your abstractions very precisely grounded in reality. And that means you can, and so it would be interesting to talk sometime about like Austrian economics, where I think a lot of it is grounded in reality. I think some of it is not as grounded in reality and the methodology of it. So it often, I think, is a little too deductive from like, okay, I have one thing, like all men act. I know everyone's going to kill me in the Bitcoin community because I'm giving just but it's a discussion for another time to be interesting. But like something like all men act to achieve ends, and it's like everything comes from that, but it's not really that there's something there, but it's like an objectivism. It would be like, that's not the starting point. So I don't use first principles. That would be like the fundamental. And the actual way you got it was you observed reality, and then you generalize from that, you generalize from that, you generalize from that. And then you see, oh, there's this fundamental thing, like all, if it's true, exactly, like all men act to achieve ends or whatever it is. And then but you got that by like seeing it in common with everything, including this series of generalizations. So you could present it like deductively, but it's very important. You actually got it inductively. Like you got it by observing reality. And so objectivism is very inductive philosophy. So a deduction is crucial. You need to be able to apply your abstractions, but it's this idea of, it's inductive. And then part of that, just one other aspect I mentioned, chapter 4 of Peikoff's book, is there's this idea of, knowledge as contextual. So the key element when you're talking about any principle, it's like you need to really understand the context in which the principle was formed. So one example somebody gave to me, I thought was a really good one. Like economics, if you look at the principle, like price controls cause shortages, right? Like price controls cause shortages. Now, so, what does that mean? Well, it means if I set the price of gasoline at $1 a gallon and there's way more demand, then what happens is there are way more people willing to pay $1 a gallon than there is gasoline. So it's going to be a shortage. That's it. There's definitely a general causal truth there, but it could be like there's some miraculous thing that comes on the market that either makes oil less than $1 a gallon or gives you a substitute that everyone uses, right? In which case the price controls wouldn't have caused a shortage, right? Because there would just be some other extraneous factor. So when you have this idea of price controls cause shortages, you just need to understand it in terms of what it, the actual causality of it. What was the context in which it was induced? It's not like this biblical thing that says literally every time there is price controls, a shortage will emerge. But it's saying there are these fundamental truths of supply and demand, where if you price things at a certain level, and then you're going to have shortage. I don't have the perfect way of explaining it, but so that's just an example.
Yeah.
You want to have these principles. You don't want to just have them as like they're not like commandments. They're these things that are ultimate. And the key is they're based. The two things are they're based on understanding of cause and effect, like precise understanding of cause and effect. Like that's any kind of principle of action. And then also you can have principles of ends, like what are you going after? And those you also want to be precise about.
I think the one thing I'll just mention about that is I think what a lot of people probably misunderstand, I think complexity theory, helps here, is just the idea of how everything is interrelated. So to your point there about the supply shortages, it's like, there's never just a simple, direct causal relationship, because you can't isolate things in the world. Like everything
Right.
is somehow interrelated. So yes, as a general principle, so I guess I'm going to paraphrase what you're saying here. As a general principle, price control will cause this, but like you said, something else might occur in this system, which is interrelated, it's non-linear, that might, like, causal relationships just are very hard to point at, and I think is that sort of the point that you're making there?
Yeah,
right? In a sense,
it's like I wish I could explain it more precisely with that example, because I'm just not, economics is not what I've mastered explaining, because sometimes it's if you think like, because the idea is that sometimes you'll summarize. The key is that what's going on is there's a certain causal understanding underlying price controls cause shortages that is a little bit more sophisticated and nuanced than every time there's price controls it'll cause shortages. It's sort of a summary of it. So I'll give you an example that I know very well. So in objectivist ethics, there's the idea of intellectual independence is key to the individual succeeding, right? And so the idea is, so what is the idea there? Well, intellectual independence means I'm thinking on my own, like I'm using my own mind to determine what's true. And so Ayn Rand would say, like, this advances your life, like being intellectually independent advances your life, right? But it's based on the causality that my only access to the truth is my own mind. That's the only access that I can control. Anything else is just, I'm just at the mercy of others. So I have to use the nature of my own, I have to respect that, and I have to be independent. So that's true. And so you can summarize it as intellectual independence is good for your life, but it's just a summary. It's not a declaration of, oh, this is always exactly going to happen. So for example, you could make up the situation. Oh, somebody, like, they just, instead of it's a stupid situation, but like imagine another Alex, and let's say my parents had pressured me to become a rabbi, which they didn't, but they definitely didn't pressure me to become what I became either. And I'm like, okay, that's not going to be good. And I'm like, I go to the rabbinical school, and then I find $1 billion on the street, and you're like, oh, see, it was good to be dependent on your parents. And it's like, no. And it doesn't mean that intellectual independence isn't good. First of all, there are all these other ways, but that not being intellectually independent will harm you. But the key was, it's still true that your own independent thought is your only access to reality. And so independence is good for your life was really summarizing that. Whereas it is always true that your own mind is your only independent access to reality. So that's like, you can sometimes formulate it, particularly when you nail the causality, you can formulate it in a universal kind of way. And often what happens is, you can think of there are principles, like there are pure causal principles that just describe cause and effect. And sometimes there are what you could call virtues, like principles about what's good for a certain goal. And usually you can formulate the ones about cause and effect a little more precisely than what's good for a certain goal, because when you have a certain goal, there are those other intervening factors that you mentioned. So it's not like, oh, if you're intellectually independent, that means every time you think on your own, you're going to have an orgasm or be a millionaire.
I wish. Um, so, okay, we've got 23 minutes left, or 22 now.
Yeah.
And there was a bunch of things I wanted to get into. So we got two options here. Should we do a part two where we save some of the energy discussion, or do you think we can jump into a few of
I
those?
think let's just do it. Let's just do it. Because I'm finishing a book, so my schedule is kind of sketchy. I'll give
Okay.
I'm very good at I can also give brief answers. So I'll give very brief answers.
No, this has been a great discussion, because like this is what I like to do on Wake Up. It's like it's different. It's not just the box that people assume the person coming on is from. So okay, let's jump into the environmental damage that is done with renewables, in particular things like solar and wind. And then as a subset to that, sort of the average rate of return for the energy input into renewables. So when I usually make the argument against renewables, and again, I'm nowhere near as deep into this as you are, but I say, look, to build a fucking solar panel or wind, turbine, you have to go and dig up all the shit out of the ground first, the rare earth, the cobalt and all the other crap. And like you basically take the energy up front and then hope that you're going to produce it back long term. So can you talk about both the energy damage done in producing this stuff and what the actual energetic rate of return is for these things?
Sure. So I'll describe it in terms of what's involved in the process of producing these renewables. And I'm going to focus on solar and wind because the renewable movement is mostly anti-hydro. So I call them unreliables. So there's this idea of like environmental impact, and I don't like that as so it's one of these package deals because it packages together ways we impact environment that's good for us, and ways we impact environment that's bad for us, and ways we impact environment that has nothing to do with us, but we care about it because we think the rest of nature is superior. So like I'm focused on negative impacts in the sense of anti-human impacts, but you could look at two kinds of impacts that are of concern. So one is just the use of the raw materials, which is not to say it's bad, but there's such a thing as a raw material that is less plentiful in the earth than another. So you have to be aware of that. And then you can also talk about just pollution or safety type impacts, which are side effects of different processes, often the mining of it. So with one thing that's interesting about just the material of it, well, there's one thing in terms of just because it's not a dense source of energy, it takes up a huge amount of land. So it takes about a huge amount of resource that way. And it also takes a lot of resource because it's very spread out. So you need a lot of materials. So if you look at different materials estimates for solar panels and wind turbines, even leaving aside the unreliability versus like a nuclear or coal, it's many times more just raw materials are needed for those things because it's a dilute source of energy. So it's very spread out. So it's a lot of land and it's more of the other materials as well. When you start to bring in batteries, there's another interesting issue with resources where nobody is really thinking about how much lithium there is in the world. And it's hard to know with any of these things because reserves doesn't mean exactly how much there is in the earth. But there are some reasons I've become pretty scared recently about just like actual amount of lithium in the world compared to these plans that people have. And that is something that people should be thinking about. And I think they're not, because it's such a kind of religious and statist approach where we want to be green, we want to be renewable, and the government's going to make it happen. And so there's no actual market where people need to think about it. And so everyone's just committing to an amount of batteries in effect that we have no idea if we can make, let alone if it's economic, which it's not even remotely economic. So I would say in terms of the resources used, there's sort of the land, the materials that are needed to build these big things, and then certain questions of supply with some of the materials, particularly involving batteries, that nobody is really thinking about. And so, and then in terms of the negative pollution or safety type impacts, which I think you're probably getting at, particularly in the mining, there's a lot of that, and I think it's important that it's not a reason why these things shouldn't be pursued, but they really need to be acknowledged so that you can pursue these things in a humane way. And part of what happens with this mythology that these are green and clean and stuff is nobody cares too much or has cared too much about where they're being mined and how they're being mined. Like, there's this cobalt, kids getting cobalt in the Congo and these toxic lakes and different kinds of in different parts of China. And now we're hearing about slave labor as well, which is a different issue, but also a humanitarian type of issue. So the key is when you're mining for these vast amounts of materials, including materials that have high toxicity, you really got to be careful about safety practices. And there is very little concern, in part because there's this effort to drive prices down. So that's what I'd say. And then in terms of the energy ROI, I think those so I don't consider myself an expert in those types of things. And in part the reason I'm not an expert is because I don't trust most of them. I think the key thing is economic ROI, because the real thing is how much resource, including how much economic resource, how much value, including human time, does it take to produce a given amount of energy for a given purpose. And the way you figure that out is you just let free people produce and consume and compete as they judge best. Because I like, what I don't like at all is these government statist planner types saying like, oh, I have this vision and this is going to be the energy ROI. And like, it doesn't really matter. I don't believe that you're telling the truth about it or that you even know, but yeah, we need just, so the energy ROI, you could think about that is one of many economic factors that people in the market should consider. But for us as outsiders, the key is just, we want the most economic thing, which means we need a free market with no subsidies and no mandates or other preferences.
100%. I think the subsidies piece is like really, really important, because it's you know, when I talk to people about, you know, things like Bitcoin and economics and everything, I say, you know, money and economics is sort of the measurement of scarce human resources, time and energy, and scarce natural resources. And when we start to fuck with that stuff, and, you know, either subsidize it or, you know, inflate it through money printing or whatever the case is, we actually distort the signals to the point where we're actually wasting human time, human energy, and natural resources. Like we're wasting this shit. And that's like my biggest gripe, I guess. You know, when people talk about, you know, I'm going to mention Bitcoin here, but when people talk about Bitcoin, it's like they say, oh yeah, and they start arguing about, oh yeah, but Bitcoin's got, you know, this much of a mix of renewables. I'm like, who gives a shit? That's not what Bitcoin's here to fix. Like Bitcoin eliminates waste, like bureaucratic waste. And, you know, because Bitcoin is, you know, tied to the second law of thermodynamics, like from an economic standpoint, like it ties, you know, I kind of call it like the study of what matters and matter. Like, so it's like empiricism, rationalization, like it ties them together in a way that, you know, if you perform a bad economic calculation, you can't bail yourself out. And as a result, what it does is it helps compound good decisions, and it helps correct bad decisions very quickly. And so Bitcoin's biggest impact, you know, from an environmental perspective on the world is going to be efficiency through eliminating waste. And at the moment, you know, we're sitting here talking about like how bad fossil fuels are, whilst, you know, you've got dickhead statists like completely burning through resources by destroying the money, by, you know, making stupid regulations. Like the masks thing over the last 18 months was a perfect example. Like I was reading some statistics somewhere, like 30 billion disposable masks get dumped, you know, every month.
Well, I think that's trivial compared. So I would just focus from a moral perspective on the time, human time that's wasted, and how little value you place on human time. So this really shows the anti-human nature of the anti-impact movement. Like, notice we talk about efficiency of everything, including human time. So efficiency really means deficiency for humans. There's that, you know, there's this classic episode of that show Bullshit with Penn and Teller, where I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a recycling one, and they're trying to like see how many different stupid bins the guy will sort his trash into. And it's like, oh, there's one bin for your toilet paper that you just, I mean, it's like the guy will accept 7 bins, and you just think, what are you doing with your life that this, and you call this efficient? Like, by what standard, by what goal is it efficient to spend all your time sorting through trash? And you just notice in economics, but particularly just in personal life, people don't value time. And so with the masks thing, and particularly outdoor masks, which made no sense at all. Like, one thing that was revealing, this was true with COVID in general, is just no valuing of free human time, as in human time that we are free to choose what we do. And like whatever you want to say about masks in terms of their efficacy, they're unbelievably unpleasant and restrictive. And I mean, it makes it so much harder to work there. And like, and the way it was discussed was not at all like if you thought, okay, it's really necessary to wear it in these indoor situations, okay, great. But you should acknowledge like, yeah, this sucks, but I'm protecting you from this other thing. So but it's just like, oh, everyone wear your mask, wear it forever. Even if you're vaccinated, wear it. Like, it just shows, it's just a little microcosm, and all the environmental stuff is much worse, of like no value of human time. And so it just shows the difference between like, is your primary moral goal advancing human flourishing, or is it eliminating human impact? And if it's eliminating human impact, human time is actually your enemy. And it's certainly the first thing that gets sacrificed.
Yeah. That's a very, very good point. I mean, I did a tweet storm before I got banned off Twitter, about that. I was like, imagine.
Oh, you're banned now?
Yeah, I got banned for like, the thought police finally got me, but I did a tweet storm about like, I was in Brazil for a little bit, and I was just like looking at how much, like in a shopping center, like people are fucking lined up, like no one can get inside a shop, no one can do anything, like everything takes 10 times as long. They had to minimize the amount of employees in there. Then they've hired these useless people to just sit there and fucking rub surfaces all day, like fucking, hypochondriacs. So it's like, and I'm sitting there looking at this, and it just dawned on me, I was like, how much productivity have we fucking wasted over some moron statists who want to fucking cling on to, some whatever semblance of pathetic control they have to like, prove to us that they actually give a shit about us, which they don't. But anyway, that's a whole other rabbit hole. We got 10 minutes. Energy independence with renewables. So like, I was speaking with, I don't know if you know Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation.
No.
So we were having a little bit of a debate. He was sort of talking about, solar renewables, and I was like, dude, you're fucking wasting your money. And he kind of tried to make the point about, California, the energy grid is a big disaster, and it's gonna keep getting worse. So he's like, look, I want to have batteries and solar panels and everything so that I'm energy independent. Now, like, does
he know what's creating the problem now?
Oh, he does. So he actually acknowledges that. He does acknowledge that, but he's like, look, I can't do anything to change that. So he goes, I'm gonna try and make my situation independent. So do you think
get a diesel generator?
Well, that's kind of what I said. So talk me through like energy independence, both, the argument for renewables, and, is it myth or fact? And how do we get, energy independence in the absence of that bullshit?
So you mean as an individual? Because there's this.
As an individual, exactly.
It's a term.
Yeah, as an individual. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, so there's this idea, there's this kind of, it's like the modern subsistence farmer ideal applied to energy, which is like, I want to create my own energy. There's that type of thing, which I think that's a weird kind of thing to want. And then there's the thing that I think is legitimate, is you want to be, and I think about a lot being a Californian and planning to live here at least for a little while longer. Like, how do I protect myself? But it's basically like, how do I protect myself from shortages and blackouts? Like, that's the real thing. And I think one thing is you just have to recognize what the main problem, which is the main problem is a total devaluing of reliable energy and a privileging of unreliable energy. Like, as I like to point out, it's very easy to generate reliable energy for every situation, certainly reliable electricity. Been done it all over the world for generations, all kinds of extreme conditions. You just have reliable, resilient power plants and a secure fuel supply. So like, it's super simple. So you have to recognize that. Having a grid is amazing for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, it allows you to just have huge differences in your demand and everything operate totally smoothly, versus if you're trying to be self-sufficient, like any significant increase in demand you have to buy a whole new supply infrastructure just for that one time. So the grids are great. So the issue is, our grid is terrible because of these unreliables policies and these anti-reliability policies. What do you do? And I think you just have to calculate, like, within what's allowed to you, what is the most cost-effective way to give me backup, and including given what I expect in the future. So I think, the kind of the most obvious thing is, diesel generator is one way of doing it. I mean, there might be restrictions around that. I mean, if you're really rich, you can buy a lot of batteries, but
Mm-hmm.
like batteries to power your house for days and like charge your car for days, like that is really, really expensive. If it was cheap,
Mm.
then everyone would just do it. So I would say that, yeah, rich people, like if you're rich, you should look at these options. You have to recognize that none of these are just band-aids that you can afford if you're rich, and they may cost
Mm.
more than you think. But for the average person, there is no way for them to become, quote, self-sufficient, and they're just at the mercy of the grid. And that's why we need to fight for much better policies.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think the push for, like, there's all this talk about, mini grids and all this sort of shit, and like kind of, decentralizing grids and making them smaller and more self-sufficient through, you know, using sunlight and wind and
Yeah,
everything.
okay,
So do
but
you think that's
that's a
that's an
joke.
entire myth?
Well,
Okay.
so anything that's contrived around the idea of using dilute intermittent sunlight and wind, it should at least be incredibly implausible that this is a
Mm-hmm,
good idea. I mean, you look at like everything in our civilization is highly controllable sources that can give us as much energy as we need when we need it. And if you look at the two, really the three leading forms, if you look at fossil fuels, which is 80% of the world's energy, and then nuclear, and then hydro, they all have in common, particularly fossil fuels and nuclear, like they are naturally stored energy. So nature stores the energy for us. Even with hydro, it evaporates the water, brings it to the top of the river, which is crucial. If we had to
mm-hmm,
do that ourselves, it'd be a pain. It naturally concentrates the energy, above all in nuclear, and then it's naturally abundant, which is not fully
mm-hmm,
true for hydro. Hydro is limited, but like, so what we have is every form of energy that really works to power civilization is a naturally stored, concentrated, abundant source of energy that then we release the energy
mm-hmm,
in an
mm-hmm,
on-demand way. And so when you're talking about, oh no, let's use something that's not concentrated, that's not stored, and then let's try to have a bunch of process around that, that is very dubious, and nobody is actually making it work. Right now, it's just a parasite on the reliable stuff. So I talk about this a
yeah.
lot at energytalkingpoints.com. So this, it could be, and in general, like the scale of the grid is a huge advantage, just because it gives you like, again, like you just have much more flexibility. The smaller it is, the more you sort of have to overbuild things for the situations where you need more. Now, it could be there's some economic way with some future small modular nuclear reactor, like all this stuff is totally untested. But in general, I would just point out that this push is all about using more unreliables. It's not about any actual problem generating low cost, reliable electricity. That's super easy to do with a modern grid, with reliable power plants that are resilient, with reliable fuel supply. So there is no problem that they're solving, except their desire to use solar and wind, which is really a religious desire motivated by their idea of eliminating human impact. And they think solar and wind is somehow natural and low impact. And then they discover it's not. And so then they oppose that, which just shows it's an
Mm-hmm,
anti-energy movement.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I actually had a point in here that I wanted to discuss about like energy density, but I think you just nailed it there
Yeah,
with
the more concentrated, the better, particularly for mobility, but also for everything, because the smaller something is to transport, like the more globally scalable it is, even if it's in, like, that's why coal is great. Like you can move it anywhere really quickly. Nuclear
mhm,
material, gas is harder. So it's a,
yeah, yeah, and I mean that for me also, when I think about energy density, like to me that just naturally ties into the most efficient use of something, as opposed to dispersing and diluting it. And like I would also argue that the amount of time, energy, effort, money that's been spent and wasted on these, I love how you call them the unreliables, but imagine all of those resources having been spent towards actually building functional grids with energy dense sources. Like we would be so much better at using that stuff, and like if you had a competitive free market towards energy, like we would be driving the price of energy and the efficient extraction of that energy downwards. But
yeah,
instead
100%.
instead we're subsidizing these unreliables with with fossil fuels, and we're making fossil fuels more expensive, and we're hiding the real cost of the renewables. So we're getting the worst of both fucking worlds.
Well, and it's unfortunately much, much worse. I agree with everything you're saying, but it's unfortunately much, much worse than that, because the real so there's the consequence of like, yeah, the energy becomes more expensive. But what most people don't get is that makes everything else more expensive. So you can think about, oh, we're wasting a lot of time building these solar panels and wind turbines, but that's nothing compared to the amount of time that's wasted because energy is more expensive than it otherwise could be. I mean, you think about, just quickly, I could go 5 minutes over if we need to, but
go. Yeah, sure.
what I call the private jet problem, which is like most of us, including me, cannot afford to fly on private jet, even though we'd love to. Like private jet is an amazing machine. I like to call it like it's a form of machine labor, machines doing work for us, but it's just not cost effective, including just because the fuel is so expensive. But imagine, if you could get energy cheap enough, you could afford a private jet, particularly if it was autonomous or robotic, right? Because ultimately the price of energy would make every material cheaper, because energy goes into everything. So you'd make every little component cheaper, and most people could afford a private jet. But if you make energy expensive, things like a washing machine, that right now it's cost effective for most of us to have a washing machine do labor for us, that wouldn't be cost effective. Our time would not be productive enough where we could afford a washing machine, and then we're washing all of our stuff by hand, which interestingly is embraced by the green movement, right? I was like, exactly. Our clothes. It just shows how anti-human it is. So that's just like the more cost effective energy is, the more cost effective everything is. The less cost effective energy is, the less cost effective everything is. So it's just this unlimited tax on human time. And of course, it's like any of those things, it hurts the poorest people by far the most, because they never can, they're prevented from getting energy in the first place, or just their food, clothing, shelter, all these basic things become more expensive. So that's why I'm so emphatic about, we need to understand how fundamental energy is, because energy is our ability to use machines to improve our lives. And so again, the cost of energy determines the cost of everything. And we should be obsessed with lower cost energy, more reliable energy, more versatile energy, more types of machines, and then more of a scale of energy. And the world doesn't care at all. We totally ignore billions of people with no energy. And we have no fear whatsoever of any of these energy policies of losing our own energy. And I think it's ultimately because our driving goal, whether we know it or not, is eliminating human impact. And when that's your focus, you don't even think about human flourishing and humans using energy. That's why we're cry about polar bears moving from one piece of ice to another, but we don't care at all about 3 billion people not having energy. So the key thing is to reset the framework and say, no, the goal, the primary moral goal is advancing human flourishing. Like, that's number one. And then number two is saying, like, cost-effective energy is fundamental to human flourishing, and the world needs far more of it. And we haven't talked much about climate, but whatever you think about our impact on climate, you have to recognize two things. One is, what I said about energy and human flourishing is true. And number two, I said a little bit about climate before. It applies to climate because energy gives us the ability to master climate. And any opinion you're going to have about the future of climate needs to be grounded in the reality, which is that we are far safer from climate than we've ever been, thanks to fossil fueled machines making us safe, like irrigation systems and sturdy buildings and heating and cooling. So anyone who talks about climate and they don't recognize that we are safer from climate than anyone in history, and that's due to fossil fuels, they know nothing. I don't care if they're a climate scientist. You are ignorant if you don't understand today's actual livability of climate. And if you don't understand climate mastery, you don't understand anything. It'd be like somebody who understood, like, I don't know, the disease of, like the disease of polio, but like they didn't know there was a polio vaccine. And they're like, oh, everyone should be terrified of polio. And it's like, oh no, we can get rid of polio. And it's like that with, like, okay, even if it gets a little warmer or there get to be more storms or that kind of thing, like, we have the vaccine, we have energy.
I think the solution for a lot of these maniacs is we need to put them on a private jet, and we need to drop them off in the middle of Africa and then just fly away and just leave them to see how well
and
they
bring the best Africans. I mean, because, in Africa, people are much more, I mean, not that I have a full read, but, when I've been talking to people, I mean, basically anyone who lives in a poor place or a quote natural place, is not a so-called environmentalist. Like you cannot
Exactly.
live in those places and be against human impact. You're like, no, I want to be in the place where I walk in some doors and there's every kind of food I could ever imagine. Like that's what you want.
100%. We need to swap their places, man. So I'm going to end on one final thing here. I think your note about energy being, so fundamental, and I mean, I'm the most Bitcoin proponent on the face of the fucking planet. But see, for me, like this is why I love Bitcoin, because it's fundamentally tied, like through proof of work, to energy. Like it is the most thermodynamically sound possible money that could ever exist. And what I think, the only way I think we actually, win the energy war is by tying economic reality to energy reality. And that's what Bitcoin fundamentally does. The only reason these clowns can actually continue to perpetuate and continue to push this, anti-human agenda, this anti-energy agenda, is because they, in the short term, have the capacity to create the illusion of making wealth by creating fraudulent wealth, right? Like making money is not making wealth. Like, producing money out of thin air doesn't actually create wealth, but it gives the illusion to a couple of these idiots that, wealth can be preserved while the rest of us become impoverished, economically and energetically speaking. But Bitcoin, by tying economics, by tying money to energy, something that cannot be forged, something that cannot be faked, you actually have a foundation upon which to do all of the things we're sort of discussing from an energetic standpoint, and for human flourishing. In the absence of that, when we can lie about the economic reality, we can basically tell ourselves that, in Ayn Randian terms, that A equals B, when in reality it fucking doesn't. And I think that anyway, that's my 2 cents about
I like that reference. I mean, my point about Bitcoin, so I've not studied this even 1/1000th as much as you can, but what I do think is really important is I talked this on Stefan Livera's, I think that's his name, podcast. If people want to see that, we had a whole different discussion there, which people might be interested about how to take pride. But I think the key is there's definitely a huge value in non-statist, non-inflatable currency. Like I believe that very strongly. I don't have the same confidence in Bitcoin in particular, just I haven't studied the realm, or like proof of stake and proof of work. I just haven't studied those things, but like there's a huge value in like real currency. And then the other thing is there's huge, like you should be proud of using energy to do things that are good. So if you think Bitcoin is doing this very important thing with currency, like you should be very proud of it using energy, and you should not be cowed into saying like, oh, let's use these unreliables, or let's lie about it, which is this crazy lies being told about Bitcoin, like, oh, 76%. Like here's the bottom line. If you're using significantly more energy going forward in one way or another, you're using more fossil fuels. You're sure as hell not using mostly
100%.
solar and wind. So don't lie about it. Why lie? If you believe in honest money, why are you talking dishonestly in terms of energy? So just understand energy, understand why it's important, and be proud of producing value using machines and machine food, including fossil fuels, which are going to be our best machine food for a long time to come.
100% agree. I think that's a potential trap that Bitcoiners need to avoid. And I mean, what you just mentioned, there, proof of work, proof of stake. Just for your reference, proof of work is tying money to energy, the unforgeable, constituent of the universe. Whereas proof of stake is literally central banking and just making shit up. So that's where, like, when you think about, like, you think about Bitcoin is sound energy money. Crypto, which I call crapto, and all the other fucking junk, is literally digital modified central banking that has no grounding or rooting in reality. And that's like where all of the crypto is a big fucking scam. And I believe it's a state attack on Bitcoin in much the same way as, the state is trying to attack, nuclear and energy and fossil fuels, because, Bitcoin is grounded in securing the money through the unforgeable work of transforming energy into a network. That's what it does. And whenever, like, a quick hack for you is, whenever you hear proof of stake and all these fucking lefty communist Ethereum monkeys and all of that, they're literally, they are using the narrative that the Al Gores of the world are using, that energy use is bad, so we should go and create a fake system here that doesn't use any energy because apparently that's better for us, which is such a scam. But anyway.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a very interesting issue. Hopefully I'll learn more about it over time.
Dude, I'll send you an article which talks about the second law of thermodynamics and how Bitcoin is sort of tied into that. I think that'll be right up your alley. But
awesome,
anyway.
Man. Oh yeah, everyone check out, I forgot to mention energytalkingpoints.com. You're probably gonna give me an opportunity to say that, but just so I remember, energytalkingpoints.com. So that is where you can sign up for my newsletter, which I highly recommend. Also, you'll learn a lot of cool stuff there. And then, I'm the Alex here who's actually on Twitter still, and I hope not to get kicked off. So for now, twitter.com/Alex Epstein.
Sweet. And so they're the two primary places that people can find you. You also run a podcast, right?
I have two. I have one called Power Hour. And so you'll learn about these if you're on my list. That's why I focus on that. But I have one called Power Hour, which is now every 2 weeks. And then I have one you can see behind me called the Human Flourishing Project, which is about some of these broader philosophical issues, particularly a lot about personal flourishing and a lot about productive work and how to do a lot of it and enjoy it at the same time.
On that one together, because for me, Bitcoin is about human flourishing, so I love that concept. But anyway, thank you again for coming on. I know you're busy. Can't wait to when's the release date for the new book? Do you know yet, or are you still sort of in the
supposed to be February 22nd. It won't be final until you see it on Amazon, but it's
okay.
Early next year. For sure.
Sweet.
Early next year.
Sweet. Awesome, man. Well, pumped for that. Thank you again for taking the time, and we'll definitely stay in touch.
All right. Thanks,
as things
Alex.
progress, man. Absolutely.